Okay, so this is a one-day topic. So I don't know if you could relate to this experience, okay? But I sometimes forget Mashiv, ומוריד הגשם, and I get annoyed. Or I guess what's even worse is you don't know that you forgot, but because it's within 30 days, then you have to go back. You know, that's how I'm pretty sure that's how everyone paskins, right? And there's this feeling of like, this is pointless, or like, why do I have to go back? You know, especially for me, at least, especially if I put in a lot of bakashos in my shemoneh esrei, there's something that feels like the second round is like cheaper or like not really real. Like I actually, I feel like the second time I'm just going through the motions, So that's not what we're going to address directly. But I think what the idea we get out of this is going to address that. At least for me, it does. Okay. So that's like my agenda. All right. So this is from a shear from the Kuntress. Okay. From למקדח ולמחרוז. Okay. That's the title. But the shear is the shear on Mashiv. Mashiv, ומוריד הגשם, and it just happens to be, this is not usually his style. The first two paragraphs are a standalone idea. Okay, so let's just read the halachos independently, and then we'll read it in the shear. All right, so Rambam, Hilchos Tefilah, וברכת Kohanim, second chapter. Okay, and second chapter in Hilchos Tefilah is the first chapter is about what the mitzvah of Tefilah is, d'oraisa and d'rabbanan. Second chapter is about additions to Tefilah. Okay, so he in Halacha Tezvav he says, Kol yimos hagashamim, all the days of the rainy season, okay, which is, he'll say, Omer bebracha shnia morid hageshem. We say in the second bracha, morid hageshem, which means
causes the rain to fall.
Yeah, it causes the rain to fall. Uvimos hachama, and in the sunny days in the summer, morid hatal, right, which means
causes the dew to fall.
Causes the dew to fall, right? Okay. Me'emasai omer morid hageshem. From when do we start saying morid hageshem? Mitfilas hamusafim shel yom tov ha'achron shel chag. From the Tefilah of Musaf of the last day of Sukkot. Okay, so Shmini Atzeres. Okay, Musaf of Shmini Atzeres. Ad Tefilah Shachris shel Yom Tov Harishon shel Pesach, until the Shachris Tefilah of the first day of Pesach. Umitfilas Hamusafin shel Yom Tov Harishon shel Pesach, and from the Musaf of the first day of Pesach, Omer Morid Hatal. Then we say Morid Hatal. Now, pretend this is your first exposure to the halacha. Okay, and I'm going to ask you a question just based on textual inference, okay? What could you infer from here about the halacha of if you forgot to say, like if you said the wrong one? What could you infer? Now, there's a lot of things you can't infer, but what do you think you could infer just from the way the Rambam presents it here?
That you would have to go back both.
Okay, well, what makes you say that? I think that's a fair possibility.
He puts them up as like two distinct and separate things.
So sorry, you just make sure I understand you correctly. Is that you would go back for which one or ones? Either one. Okay, either one, right? Yeah. You say something different or the same?
I would say the opposite, and I think that the fact that it's only sometimes it's not important. It's therefore not important.
So I think you're both right. Okay, namely, but what would you infer? You would infer that it's the same din for each one because he presents them equally, right? Either they're ma'akiv or they're not ma'akiv. Yeah. Okay, yeah. Right? Because like he just says, oh, you do this one during this season, you do that one during that season. Okay. However, in chapter 10, okay, which is the chapter about mistakes in Tefilah, then here's what he says: 10:8. If you make a mistake during the rainy season, velo amar morid hageshem, and you did not say morid hageshem, velo morid hatal, and you did not say morid hatal, choser larosh, then you got to go back to the beginning. All right, so that's where we're at right now. If you said, I know there's like there's two minhagim, right? There's the in Art Scroll, which I think must be an Ashkenaz psak. Then a lot of Ashkenazim don't say morid hatal during the other time. So if you didn't say morid hageshem or morid hatal when you're supposed to, then you go back. Okay. V'im hizkir hatal, but if you mention morid hatal, eno choser, then you don't go back. Yeah. Okay. Right. So that's like, I guess that's lucky, right? If you are, at least going to the Rambam, right?
It happens so many times.
Yeah.
I forget, and I'm like, well, wait, I know that.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And again, by the way, just because this is Rambam Bekius, I'm not going into what psak is, but that's what the Rambam says. Okay. V'im tabi mosachama, but if you made a mistake during the summer, the amar morid hageshem, and you said morid hageshem when you were supposed to say morid hatal, choser larosh, then you go back to the beginning. Okay. V'im lo hizkir tal, and if he did not mention tal, so we don't make him go back. She'ein hatal ne'etzar, because tal is never withheld. Okay, the eno tzarech bakasha, and does not need a request. Okay.
Why do we have it in there at all?
So why do we have it in there at all? Because that's a good question. Okay, so that's one good question. Okay. There are at least two more questions here. One question follows directly from what we said last time. I kind of set it up for the question, right? What we just said from the not last time, from the last halacha.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. So we said from the last halacha, it seems like these two insertions should be equal. Either they're both ma'akev or they're not both ma'akev. Here it's different, right? Like so the question is like, how do we account for why did the Rambam present them as if they're equal in the halacha, and then in the halachas about the mistakes, we see that they are different. Okay. Then there's another question that comes from what these insertions are. And yeah.
Different question.
Sure. Yeah, you get maybe other questions also.
Him calling me not sorry bakasha seems to suggest that more agesham is a bakasha.
Exactly. Right. And what's wrong with that? It's a sheva. Okay, right. Okay, good. So we have the questions that the Kuntress asks. Okay, so let's just read in the Kuntress. Ein Hilchos Tefilah beis tesvav shemashma shedin Mashiv וברכת הגשם v'din ומוריד hatal shavin, right? So the first halakha implies that the two halachas are equal, right? The two insertions are equal. Ulam, however, Hilchos Tefilah perik yod halacha ches shemachzir noso im shachach Mashiv וברכת הגשם mash ein kein למוריד hatal. But you see that the halachas are different. So the question is, how do we account for that difference? Okay, 2. Od yesh lahavin madua im amar morid hatal. Oh, I forgot one. We can't go back now. Od yesh lahavin madua im amar morid hatal bimos hagashamim shein machzir noso v'halo adayin lo hizkir geshem b'tefilaso. Okay, so here's the thing. He's saying like this: if it's true that if you said morid hatal during the rainy season, he says you don't have to go back, but you didn't mention geshem.
Right.
So shouldn't you have to go back? In other words, it's a weird thing that he says if you didn't mention geshem or tal, hold on, right? If you didn't mention geshem or tal, then you go back. But if you didn't mention, if you did mention tal, then you don't go back, right? But if the whole thing is like mentioning morid the geshem is ma'akev, so you still didn't mention geshem, right? So it's weird that tal somehow like helps you, even though you're supposed to mention geshem. Yeah, somehow it's a stand-in, okay, right? And then the last question is the one we asked, the David asked, also inyan yesh lahavin tam haramam sham she'im lo hizkir tal bimos hachama she'im machzir noso mishum shetal eno tzarech bakasha. We also have to understand the reason for the Rambam there, that if he didn't mention tal in the summer, we don't make him go back because tal doesn't require bakasha. V'halo hamaduber shamhu hazkara v'lo bakasha. But isn't tal and geshem a hazkara, which is like a mention of praise, not a bakasha? Okay, so those are the three questions. Yeah.
I thought the question was stronger than that.
Yeah.
Are we in the parashman esrei, which doesn't talk about or can't? I would assume can't talk about bakasha, meaning. Almost it's talking about like that's
yeah. Okay, so you could say that, but there are bakashos that we do insert, namely in the asserts of tshuva, and how can we put in bakashos there? Because a bakasha of the rabbin is permissible to insert there, but you just can't do bakashos of the African. Yeah. Okay. So because we're only going to spend one day on this, let's go to the answer. Okay. And then I have a bookkeeping announcement for after this. Okay. V'yesh lomar. Okay, I think this is a beautiful idea. V'yesh lomar, we can say as follows: Ika shnei dinim b'mashiv v'rochim gashem. Okay, classic Brisker. There's two dinim in mashiv v'rochim gashem. Ha'echad, first one, who shebebirkas ha'gvuros tzrichim lomar shevach lashem al zeh shehu mechaye es ha'olam b'mayim, is we need to praise Hashem for the fact that He gives life to the world through water. Okay, bazeh, in this regard, geshem v'tal havyan shavim, then rain and dew are equal. Okay. But for this type of shavak, we mention each type of water in its time. And that's generally speaking what we do for brachos in general, is you give the bracha that is appropriate to the subject. So during the rainy season, we say rain. During the dewy season, we say dew. Okay, so that's what the Rambam was alluding to in the first halacha where they're equal. Aval, ika od din b'mashiv v'rochim gashem. But there's another din, v'hu, and namely shelifnei she'ela l'gashamim ba'inan ritzui, that before asking for rain in Barech Aleinu, okay, in the year, before we get to that point in the year, ba'inan ritzui, we need ritzui. Now, how do you translate ritzui? Like ritzei Hashem Elokeinu, ritzei v'aglitenu. What? Favor. Appeasement is another way to say it. Okay, there's a famous Ritui story. You know the Ritui story? What was it?
The question, but in phrasing it as a what's it called?
As a praise?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So that is what he's going to say. Let me allude to the story. Anyone know the Ritui story with Rebbe? I've heard different versions of the story. I heard that it involved Rabbi Weiss, but I've heard it told about someone else. Is that there's a Shavuot shir on I forgot what the topic was. Shavuot shir that Rebbe gave, and this was back in the day when the shir were like 6 hours, whatever. So the whole first day they're all talking about like Ritui, and then the Svara is about Ritui. And then at a certain point, like whoever asked the question, Rabbi Weiss raised his hand and said, Rebbe, what is Ritui? And like, it was a whole thing, like no one knew what Ritui was, So this is a whole topic. And I don't even think we need that in order to answer this. I'll give my theory in a second. So where does he get this from that before asking for rain, you need Ritui? So it's an open Gemara in Taanis, Dalet Amud Beis, that says, Amrle Abaye Bishlama Tchilaso Mazkir Haskara Nami Ritsui She'elahi, which I don't understand if I just read the Hebrew, but the Steinsaltz fills it in. Ki Haskara, that mentioning this insertion in the second bracha, Gam Kain Ritsui She'elahi. What does that mean? Shahazkara B'tchila, that having a praise at the beginning of the rainy season, Ba'al L'Ritsui Pnei Hashem, is coming as a way to appease Hashem, Kedei Sheyuchol Achach Lishol Ulvakesh, so that later on we can ask for rain in Baruch Aleinu. Okay, now that idea sounds heretical, right? Like we need to bribe Hashem. Okay, so I'll explain that in a second. So then he says like this. Let's just look at the structural svara. Inyan machzir noso toli b'hashmatas haritzui v'lo b'hashmatas hashavach. Okay, the halacha of making the guy go back and daven again is not because you omitted sheva, is because you omitted ritzui. Okay. And therefore, Rambam she'in machzir noso l'tal mishum shetal eno tzarich bakasha. And that's why the Rambam says that you don't make him go back if he omits tal, because tal doesn't need request. Okay, I'll summarize it in a second. The in hizkir tal b'mos hageshamim, and if you did mention tal in the rainy season, in machzir noso mipnei shel-ritzui sagile b'haskaras tal, because if you mention tal in the rainy season, you don't make him go back, because for ritzui purposes, it's enough to mention tal. Because tal is related in general to rain. The same tal mata, like we say, the same tal mata. Okay, so what he's saying is like this: is you might think that so before we learn this year, you would think that you're inserting two forms of shevach, right? Either Mashiv the Geshem or Morid tal, and that somehow if you omit Mashiv the Geshem, then omission of that shevach is ma'akev, and you have to go back. But what the Baal Kuntress is saying is no. It's truly mentioned shevach, and that is a din, but in that sense they're equal. But really, there's a special thing that before you ask for rain in Baruch Aleinu in December, you need ritzui, and ritzui is another din in saying Mashiv Baruch Hu Geshem. So the reason why you have to go back is you can't omit the ritzui. Okay, now what does this mean? So anyone want to venture a guess about what ritzui is? Like, what's this idea of like you need ritzui before bakasha?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about this before we did the answer. I was like thinking about like I had some thought about like the staging kind of thing. But to me, it makes sense that like it's like a framing of like the Gavra in like Tefilah, like any other kind of like framing of like who you're standing before, what you want, what God is,
Okay, good.
And like what God can do. So like when you frame your bakashos, before you say them, you put yourself into that proper mind.
Okay, exactly, right. That is exactly what I was thinking. Is that just like in general, we went through the shear in my shear, but then Rav Pesach went through it last year, right? That you can't just rush into bakasha. You need to do shevach to understand who God is, who you are, and what your relationship is. So too, if you think you could just ask for rain, like just demand rain, that's a distortion, right? That really you need to recognize that God is to be praised for rain and see what your place is, and then like an Eved asking for his needs. So now in terms of what I mentioned to you, the feel badness of if you forget Mashiv Baruch Hu Geshem, you have to go back. To me, like if it was just, okay, I omitted this one seasonal praise, so sue me, that feels like trivial. But here, to me, I don't know, this is my own subjective association here. Like it's a different feeling of like, oh, like if I don't engage in ritzui, I don't have the right to ask for rain on December 4th and on. And like and there's an error of like assuming that God just like owes me rain. therefore my tefillah is like invalid. Like that's like a presumptuous like mistake, So to me, it like I decided to give this. When was it? Was it on Shabbos? I can't remember. It was a Shabbos on Friday. I forgot, and I was all grumbling to myself, and then I remembered this idea, and I was like, oh, like okay, like so my first tefillah was really like almost like a brazen like thing, and like it's good to redo it again. And again, there's a whole other rest of the shear here, but that's just one isolated idea. Okay, so I'm going to pause. I'm going to stop this, and 2 items on the agenda.